Tonight, we travel back in time, not to a battlefield, not to a throne room. Tonight, we travel to a coastline, somewhere along the eastern Mediterranean, around 300 BCE. A night is going wrong. The wind has shifted. The sailors on deck already know what that means. You can see it in the way they stop talking to each other and start looking at the horizon. The waves are building. The ship is riding lower than it should. And somewhere in the cargo hold, sealed in amphorae, sits a fortune in purple dye. Tyrian purple, they called it. Worth more than gold. The color that only emperors were allowed to wear. Extracted, drop by drop, from thousands of sea snails. Loaded onto this ship by a Phoenician merchant from the island of Cyprus, a man named Zeno. The sea took the ship. The dye went to the bottom. And a man washed ashore with nothing. No cargo. No money. No plan. No obvious future. Just wet clothes, a body that had survived when it might not have, and a shoreline he had not expected to see. And then this is the part that has kept people telling this story for 23 centuries. This man got up, walked into an Athenian bookshop, and picked up a book. It was Xenophon's Memorabilia, collection of conversations featuring Socrates. He started reading. He stopped. He looked up at the bookseller and asked, "Where can I find a man like this?" The bookseller happened to notice a philosopher walking past outside. "Follow that man," he said. Zeno followed. And the Zeno who had walked into that bookshop never quite walked back out. Something stayed. Something began. A philosophy was born from a shipwreck. Wisdom flowered from loss. And that wisdom, refined over centuries, tested against slavery and empire and plague and death, is still speaking tonight, to anyone who cannot sleep. To anyone who is holding on too hard to something they cannot control. Are you holding on to something right now? Something you're afraid to lose, or something you've already lost, or something you've never quite managed to hold in the first place. A job, a relationship, your health as it used to be, a version of yourself you remember more clearly than the one you see in the mirror some mornings. Or maybe something more diffuse than that, a gnawing sense that life is passing too quickly, or too quietly, or in the wrong direction altogether. We all hold on. We close our fingers around things, white-knuckled sometimes, breathing shallowly, as if our grip is all that stands between us and disaster. Stoicism is the philosophy of learning to open that hand. Tonight we will walk alongside three people who didn't just believe this philosophy, they lived it. In circumstances so extreme that their lives became the argument. There was Epictetus, born a slave, chains on his legs, freer in his mind than most emperors ever managed to be. There was Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the Western world, who spent his evenings alone in a military tent reminding himself he was nothing special. And there was Seneca, a man of staggering wealth and influence, who faced the order of his own death without putting down his pen. These three men never all met. They lived across different centuries. They occupied positions about as far apart as human society allows the slave, the senator, the emperor. And yet they were bound together by a single, hard-won recognition. When we stop fighting for control over what was never ours to control, we begin, for the first time, to live freely. That is Stoicism. And that is what tonight is about. Settle in. Let the room be quiet around you. And let's go back to the world where all of this began, because the world that created Stoicism is worth understanding. It was, in ways that matter, remarkably like our own. To understand why Stoicism emerged when it did, you have to feel what it was like to live in the ancient Mediterranean world in the years after Alexander the Great's death. And I mean feel it, not just know the dates. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE. He was 32 years old. He had, in a single lifetime, remade the map of the known world. His armies had marched from Macedonia to Egypt, through Persia, all the way to the edges of India. Everywhere they went, Greek culture went with them, the language, the architecture, the philosophy, the theater. This age became known as the Hellenistic period, and it glittered with intellectual achievement. Alexandria built the greatest library the ancient world had ever seen. Mathematics flourished. Art flourished. The mixing of Greek and Eastern cultures produced intellectual hybrids that would shape human thought for millennia. But when Alexander died without a clear heir, everything he had built began to fracture. His generals, the Diadochi, the successors, turned on each other almost immediately. Wars broke out across the entire Greek-speaking world. Ptolemy seized Egypt. Seleucus grabbed the eastern territories. Antigonus fought for Macedonia. For 50 years, the fighting continued. Cities that had stood for centuries were sacked in an afternoon. Kings who seemed invincible were executed within a year. Borders shifted with every season. And for the ordinary person living through all of this, the merchant, the farmer, the artisan, there was no stable ground to stand on. Let yourself inhabit one of those ordinary people for a moment. You are a potter in Athens in 300 BCE. Your workshop sits at the edge of the Agora, the great open marketplace that is the beating heart of the city. You have been making pots here for 20 years, the way your father made them before you, the way his father made them before him. Every morning you come in before sunrise, when the air still holds the cool of the night. You can smell the salt coming off the harbor, the olive oil heating in the kitchen 2 doors down, the clay that has soaked overnight in the wood and trough by the wall. You can hear the first vendors setting up their stalls, the slow rumble of cartwheels on stone, the distant clang of the blacksmith opening his shop. This city, these rhythms, this workshop, they are your world. And for most of your life, they have felt permanent. But for the past decade, nothing has felt permanent. The king you swore allegiance to 3 years ago is dead, killed by one of his own officers. The trade routes that kept your glazes coming in from the east have been disrupted by yet another border war. Your neighbor's son was conscripted last spring and has not come home. Twice in the past year, foreign armies have marched through the city. They didn't burn it this time, but you felt, standing in your doorway, watching them pass, how completely your fate depended on decisions made by people who don't know your name. That feeling, that sense of groundlessness, that recognition that everything you have built can be unmade by forces entirely outside your control. That is the emotional soil from which Stoicism grew. And now let's see who is walking through that agora. In that changed and frightening world, the philosophical schools of Athens were still open, still teaching. You could walk past Plato's academy, where aristocratic young men learned to contemplate ideal forms and just cities. You could visit Aristotle's Lyceum, where the Peripatetics still argued about virtue and the good life, as practiced by the well-born citizen of a stable city-state. Epictetus was teaching in his garden, telling students that the good life was quiet pleasure, friendship, and withdrawal from the tumult of politics. The cynics were performing their philosophical stunts in public, sleeping in the agora, refusing all social conventions, challenging passers-by to explain why they cared about things that couldn't last. All of these schools had things to offer, but none of them quite answered the question that most urgently needed answering. Not what is the ideal city? Not what makes a life pleasant? But how do I keep my footing when the ground itself keeps shifting? How do I remain myself when everything around me is changing? If the external world cannot be relied upon and experience was making clear that it could not, is there something internal that can be? That was the question. And Zeno of Citium, a shipwrecked foreigner who had no business being in Athens, turned out to have an answer. He wasn't Athenian. He wasn't even Greek, not by blood. He came from Phoenician stock, from the island of Cyprus, from a family of traders who had moved goods across the Mediterranean for generations. Ancient sources describe him as dark-skinned, physically awkward, thin and tall, and not particularly impressive to look at. He held himself apart from the social world of Athens. He refused dinner invitations from powerful patrons. He ate simply. He dressed plainly. In a city where philosophy had long been the province of well-born insiders, Zeno was a conspicuous outsider, and it was precisely his outsider's eye that let him see what the insiders had missed. Over the years after his shipwreck and his encounter with the philosopher Crates, Zeno studied widely. He absorbed the Cynics' contempt for social convention while rejecting their embrace of performance and spectacle. He studied with philosophers from the Megarian school, sharpening his logic. He read and reread the older traditions, and gradually, through decades of thinking, he arrived at something that felt more solid than any of it. He began teaching in the covered colonnade on the north side of the Agora, the Stoipoikal, or painted porch, so called because its walls were covered with famous frescoes. Anyone could come and listen. Slaves came, foreigners came, women came. People who had never been welcomed into the academy or the lyceum came, and found something that spoke to them. Because Zeno taught that the good life, the truly good life, the life that cannot be taken from you, has nothing to do with which city you were born in, or which family you belong to, or how much property you own, or how the political winds are currently blowing. It depends on one thing and one thing only: your own will, your own judgment, the quality of your inner life. And here is the crucial point: that will, that judgment, that inner life, no external power can touch it. Not a storm, not a tyrant, not a war, not poverty, not illness, not death itself. This was the seed of Stoicism. And from that seed, three people in particular grew the philosophy into something that has outlasted empires. Now let's meet the first of them. And I want you to hold on to the image as I describe him, because the gap between his circumstances and his philosophy is almost too large to believe. Epictetus was born a slave. Somewhere around 50 CE, in the city of Hierapolis, modern-day Pamukkale in western Turkey, a woman gave birth to a child who was, from the moment of his first breath, someone else's property. We don't know his mother's name. We don't know his father. We know that he was brought to Rome as a slave, and that his master was a man named Epaphroditus, who served as personal secretary to the Emperor Nero. Think about what that means. Epaphroditus worked in the nerve center of the most powerful empire the Western world had ever seen. He had access to the emperor's ear. He was a man of significant influence and, probably, significant cruelty. Ancient sources suggest he was not gentle with those beneath him. And Epictetus was his property, not his employee, not his servant, his property. Epictetus had no legal rights. He could not own anything. He could not go where he chose, eat what he chose, sleep where he chose, speak to whom he chose. He could not refuse what was asked of him, and he could not leave. We don't know exactly how Epictetus came to study Stoic philosophy. It was not uncommon in Rome for educated slaves to serve as household teachers or scribes, and Epaphroditus may have allowed Epictetus to study simply because it made him more useful. By some route, Epictetus found his way to the teachings of Musonius Rufus, a Roman Stoic philosopher who was one of the most important teachers of his generation. And what Epictetus found in that philosophy changed everything about how he understood his own situation. There is a story, we cannot confirm it, and it may have grown in the telling, but it has been told for 2,000 years because it crystallizes something essential about the day Epaphroditus began to twist Epictetus's leg. Why he did this, we don't know. Perhaps it was a test. Perhaps it was casual cruelty. Perhaps he had heard Epictetus speak about equanimity and wanted to see how deep it went. Epictetus, the story goes, said calmly, "You are going to break it." Epaphroditus did not stop. The leg snapped. Epictetus said, "Did I not tell you that you were going to break it?" No cry, no curse, no begging, just a statement of observed fact, delivered without apparent agitation. Whether this happened exactly as described, I cannot say. But the reason it has survived is this: it is a perfect image of what Epictetus spent the rest of his life teaching. His body could be broken, his freedom of movement could be denied, his labor could be taken, his comfort could be ignored. All of those things were, in the language he would later use, not up to him. But his response to what was happening to him, the quality of his mind in that moment, the attitude with which he met the pain that was up to him, and nothing, he believed, could take that away. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He was eventually freed. The circumstances are not recorded. After the Emperor Domitian expelled philosophers from Rome, Epictetus moved to the city of Nicopolis, in what is now northwestern Greece, and opened a philosophical school. Students came from across the empire. He never wrote anything down himself. He taught by conversation, by questioning, by the kind of dialogue that Socrates had pioneered 4 centuries earlier. One of his students, a man named Arrian, who would go on to become a celebrated historian and military commander, sat in the lectures and recorded what he heard. Those notes became the discourses, and the essential distillation of those discourses became a short manual called the Enchiridion, a word that means something like handbook, or field guide, or the thing you keep in your hand. The Enchiridion opens with a sentence that is, I would argue, one of the most consequential in the history of Western thought. Simple to state, almost impossible to fully live. Some things are in our control and others not. That is the sentence. The entire philosophy unfolds from it. What is in our control? Epictetus is precise: our opinions, our impulses, our desires, our aversions, the way we interpret what happens to us, the attitude we choose to take toward our circumstances, the movements of our will. In Greek, he called this realm our prohairesis, our capacity for voluntary choice, the inner self that deliberates and decides. What is not in our control? Everything else. Our bodies, they get sick, they age, they can be hurt. Our reputations, other people form their own opinions and we cannot dictate them. Our property, it can be taken. The actions of others, we can influence them but not control them. The outcomes of our efforts, we can work hard and still fail. The length of our lives, we do not get to negotiate that. The Stoic move, the move that sounds simple and is profoundly difficult, is this: pour your energy into what is yours to control. Release your grip on what is not. Consider how much of the anxiety you carry tonight belongs to the second category. Will the test results be good or bad? Will the person you care about stay or leave? Will the economy recover? Will the job be there? Will the children be safe? Every one of these falls outside the zone Epictetus is pointing to. And every hour of anguish spent on them is an hour not spent on the one thing you actually can shape: how you think, how you choose, who you are in the face of what happens. This is not passivity. Epictetus himself was one of the most intensely purposeful human beings in recorded history. He cared enormously about his students, about virtue, about the quality of his own character. But he directed that caring with absolute precision toward the place where it could actually do something. And he did this, let us not forget, as a man who had been owned, who could not vote, could not own property, could not protect his own body from casual cruelty. If Epictetus could locate freedom in those conditions, the question his life poses to each of us is an uncomfortable one. What exactly is your excuse? Now let's cross the social world in the other direction entirely, and meet Seneca. Lucius Aeus Seneca, born around 4 BCE in Corduba, modern Córdoba, in what is now Spain. His father was a celebrated rhetorician, known to history as Seneca the Elder. The family was wealthy, educated, connected. Young Seneca came to Rome and quickly distinguished himself as an orator, as a playwright, as a public intellectual. His tragedies were performed across the empire. His speeches were studied in the schools. He accumulated a personal fortune that ancient sources describe as staggering. One historian estimates it at a modern equivalent of several $100 million. He held political influence at the highest level, serving as tutor to the young Prince Nero, then, as the emperor's chief advisor during the early years of Nero's reign. He was, in every material sense, the opposite of Epictetus. And yet he was reading the same philosophy, writing about it, arguing for it, trying with varying and publicly admitted degrees of success to live it. This is the tension that makes Seneca the most humanly interesting of the 3 Stoics we're meeting tonight. Here is a man with a private fortune and a senator's political power, telling his readers that attachment to wealth and power is the source of unnecessary suffering. Here is a man who spent years at Nero's side while Nero grew into a tyrant, trying to explain why proximity to power did not compromise his philosophical integrity. Seneca himself never pretended he had resolved this tension. In one of his letters, he makes a statement that has stopped readers for 2,000 years. He says he is not a sage, not a philosopher who has arrived at wisdom. He is a patient, still ill, still in treatment. He is not the doctor, he is the other sick man in the hospital ward, sharing what he has learned so far about the disease they both have. This kind of honesty is what separates Seneca from the merely pious. He does not claim to have solved the problem of being human. He shows you someone wrestling with it, openly, in real time. His most enduring work is the collection of 124 letters he wrote to his friend Gaius Lucilius, a Roman official serving in Sicily, and a man who was himself trying to live philosophically. The letters were written in the last years of Seneca's life, when he had withdrawn from active politics and was trying to focus on what he increasingly felt was the real work: understanding how to die well. The letters circle the same themes again and again, like a person returning to a fire. Time, death, friendship, anger, the gap between the life we say we want and the life we actually lead. And they do this with a warmth and an immediacy that feels less like philosophy and more like conversation with someone who takes both of you seriously. His most famous opening, from the very first letter: "Et fac, mea Lucili vindicate tibi," claim yourself for yourself. He goes on to observe something that should feel painfully contemporary: "We guard our money carefully," he says. "We lock it up, we keep accounts. But our time, which is the one thing that truly cannot be replaced, the one thing that, once spent, is gone. Absolutely, we give it away as if it costs us nothing. We let other people take it, we throw it away ourselves, into empty conversations, into entertainments that leave no residue, into the anxious anticipation of futures that may never arrive. Life is not short," Seneca says. "We make it short." How different does this sound from a conversation about why we can't seem to stop scrolling? The letters also contain some of Seneca's most striking practical instructions. He recommends setting aside time each day to do nothing, not productive nothing, but genuinely quiet nothing, time in which the mind is allowed to settle and notice what it actually contains. He recommends the daily practice of reviewing the day before sleep, not to flagellate yourself over failures, but to observe with honest curiosity: where was I anxious today? Where was I small? Where did I give energy to something outside my control? This is not guilt, it is diagnosis. He also writes repeatedly about death, not morbidly, but insistently. He believes that our relationship with death is the key to our relationship with life. When we live as if death is unthinkable, he argues, we live badly. We defer the things that matter, we waste the time we have, we hold too tight to arrangements that are temporary. When we befriend the fact of death, when we let ourselves actually feel that this life will end, and that today is part of that finite whole, then time becomes sacred. Then the present moment stops being a corridor to some other moment and starts being the only moment there is. "Let us prepare our minds," he writes, "as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day." Seneca's end came at the order of the student he had shaped. It was 65 CE. A conspiracy against Nero, the Pisonian conspiracy, named for the Roman senator Calpurnius Piso, had been discovered, or, some believe, confabulated. Nero used it to settle accounts with anyone he considered a threat. Seneca's name appeared on the list. Whether he was actually involved in the plot, scholars still debate. What is not debated is the sequence of what followed. Imperial soldiers came to the house where Seneca was staying outside Rome. They conveyed the emperor's order. Seneca was to die, and the method of death was his to choose. He called his friends together. He told them not to weep, that he had known this was coming, that he had written about it for years, that he had tried to prepare for it precisely because he knew the moment would arrive. He tried to revise his will, but the officers would not permit it. He sat with those he loved and spoke to them, and those present later recorded that his tone was one of quiet philosophical deliberation, as if this were just another evening's conversation about how to live. He opened the veins in his wrists. The blood came slowly. His body was aged, depleted from years of chronic illness. He drank a cup of hemlock, the poison of Socrates, a detail that could not have been lost on Seneca. That too came slowly. He was moved to a hot bath, hoping the steam would help. And in those final hours, as his body gave way by degrees, he kept talking. He kept asking his secretary to take down what he was saying. He turned his dying into one final philosophical act, one last demonstration of what he had tried to teach. Stoicism, at its core, is not a set of ideas to agree with. It is a practice to rehearse. Seneca rehearsed it until there was nothing left of him to rehearse with. And now, the third figure, the one who, for many people, embodies Stoicism most completely. Perhaps because of the extraordinary position he occupied, and the extraordinary nature of what he chose to do with his evenings when no one was watching. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome from 161 to 180 CE, by any reasonable measure, the most powerful human being in the Western world during those 2 decades. Commander of the Roman legions, ruler of an empire stretching from Scotland to the Persian border, holding the lives of 50 million people within the reach of his decisions. Every night, he wrote in a private journal. He called it, in Greek, things to oneself Theiseuton. We call it meditations. And the thing that makes it unlike any other philosophical document from the ancient world, or really from any world, is this: it was never meant to be read by anyone other than himself. It was not written for an audience. It was not composed with publication in mind. It was a man talking to himself, in the dark, about the gap between the person he was and the person he was trying to be. The journal begins, in the traditional numbering, with a long list of debts. Not financial debts, but debts of character, the qualities he learned from specific people. From his grandfather, he writes, he learned gentleness and self-control. From his father's memory, he learned modesty. From his mother, he learned piety and simplicity. From his philosophy teacher Rusticus, he learned to resist the pull of rhetoric for its own sake, and to read carefully rather than skimming. From Epictetus, or rather from the copy of Epictetus's discourses that Rusticus gave him, he learned the foundational distinction between what is up to us and what is not. This is worth pausing over. The Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the world, spent years of his life modeling his inner life on the words of a man who had been a slave. That is not a trivial fact. It tells you something essential about what Stoicism cares about, and what it doesn't. Marcus's reign was not peaceful. From almost the first day of his time as emperor, he was managing crises. A war with Parthia, the great eastern rival of Rome, broke out in the early years of his reign. His armies eventually won, but the troops who came home brought something with them: a devastating plague. The Antonine Plague swept through the empire with a ferocity that ancient sources describe in terms that read almost like modern accounts of pandemic. Bodies piling up in the streets, physicians fleeing the cities, temples overwhelmed with desperate supplicants. At its height, some modern historians estimate the plague was killing 2,000 people a day in Rome alone. Over the course of the epidemic, it may have killed between 5 and 10% of the entire imperial population. Marcus stayed. He organized plague relief. He presided over funerals. He wrote letters. And in the evenings, in his tent, because for much of his reign, he was stationed on the northern frontier, fighting a long grinding war against Germanic tribes who kept pressing across the Danube. He opened his journal. What he wrote there is not heroic. It is not the triumphant record of a great man's great thoughts. It is something more valuable than that. It is the private testimony of someone who is tired, who sometimes fails at his own values, who struggles with irritability and impatience and the deep longing for a simpler life, and who keeps coming back, night after night, to ask himself, did I live it today? What got in the way? How can I do better tomorrow? Confine yourself to the present, he writes. And in another passage, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. And this the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. That last line, the obstacle is the way, has become perhaps the most widely quoted Stoic maxim of the modern era. And it is worth understanding what Marcus actually meant, because it's easy to reduce it to a piece of motivational decoration and miss its depth. He did not mean that obstacles secretly contain the thing you were trying to do, or that the universe is designed to help you if you just think positively. He meant something harder than that. He meant that the practice of virtue, the exercise of who you are trying to be, requires resistance. That without the obstacle, there is no material to work with. That the difficulty is not a detour from your life, it is the territory of your life. The person you become is made precisely out of how you handle what you didn't want to happen. His northern frontier campaigns were the obstacle. The plague was the obstacle. The endless ceremony and tedium of court life was the obstacle. And through each of them, he kept asking, can I be, in this, the person I am trying to be? He often couldn't. His journal is honest about that too. There is one decision Marcus made that Stoic philosophy would have counseled against, and it has haunted his legacy ever since. He had a son. His name was Commodus, and when Marcus died in 180 CE, he left the empire to Commodus. The emperors who had preceded Marcus in the Antonine dynasty, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, had each selected their successor not by bloodline but by merit, adopting the most capable available man. This practice of adoption had produced the greatest succession of competent emperors in Roman history. Marcus knew this. His philosophy, with its emphasis on reason and the common good, pointed directly toward continuing it. He chose his son instead. Commodus was, by the historical record, one of the worst emperors Rome ever had. He believed himself to be the reincarnation of Hercules. He fought in the arena as a gladiator, a profound disgrace by Roman standards. He renamed the months of the year after himself. He had senators executed for minor offenses or no offense at all. He ultimately died strangled in a bath by a wrestling partner, who had been hired by conspirators to finish what the poison they'd given him at dinner had started too slowly. Why did Marcus make this choice? We can't know for certain. He may have believed that a biological heir would provide more political stability than an adopted one. He may have told himself that Commodus would grow into the role. He may simply have been a father who could not bring himself to choose a stranger over his child. Whatever the reason, even the greatest Stoic in the Western tradition could not always live up to Stoicism, the philosophy he had practiced every night in his journal. The philosophy that called him to set aside personal attachment for the good of the whole at the final test. He chose differently. This failure does not diminish Marcus Aurelius. In a strange way, it completes him. It makes him useful to us in a way that a perfect philosopher-emperor would not be. Because we are also people who know what we should do and sometimes don't do it. We are also people who love too hard and judge too softly when it comes to those we love. We are also people who fail our own values, and we keep trying. Which is, finally, what Stoicism asks. Now let us go inside the philosophy itself, not just its biography, but its actual practice. Because Stoicism was never primarily a set of ideas to hold, it was a set of exercises to do daily, deliberately, with full knowledge that you would imperfectly and begin again tomorrow. The foundation is the dichotomy of control, Epictetus's great division of all things in the world into what is up to us and what is not up to us. Everything we do in Stoic practice flows from this distinction. Before reacting to anything, a slight, a disappointment, a piece of bad news, the Stoic pauses and asks, does this belong to my domain or not? If not, the energy that would have gone into resisting or lamenting it is redirected inward, toward the one domain where energy can actually make a difference. This sounds like detachment. It is not detachment. The Stoics were not indifferent to outcomes. They cared about what happened. They worked hard to achieve good things in the world. But they held the results of their effort with open hands, committing their will to the effort itself rather than to a particular outcome. The Stoic archer, as the metaphor goes, aims carefully, draws the bow with full skill and attention, and then, when the arrow is released, accepts that the wind may take it where it will. The aim was in the archer's control. The wind is not. The first practical exercise, negative visualization. The Stoics called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. The practice is this: regularly imagine that you have lost what you value most: your health, your partner, your work, your children, your home. Sit with the imagined loss. Feel it. This sounds, at first hearing, like a recipe for anxiety. But it is the opposite. The purpose is not to frighten yourself but to wake yourself up. We live surrounded by blessings that we have stopped perceiving as blessings, because they are always there. The Stoics believed that imagining their absence briefly, deliberately, as a practice rather than a wallowing, would restore the sense of gratitude that habit erodes. Epictetus put it this way: when you kiss your child goodnight, remind yourself inwardly that this child is mortal, that you do not know how many more such kisses are granted to you. Does this sound morbid? Try it. Notice what it does to the quality of the kiss. The second exercise, a more fatty love of fate. This is one of the most challenging Stoic commitments, and perhaps the one most often misunderstood. It is not resignation. It is not the dull acceptance of whatever happens. It is something much more radical: the decision to want what happens, not merely to endure it. The Stoics believed in a cosmos ordered by logos, a rational principle underlying all of nature. Everything that happens is part of this order. The loss, the illness, the failure, the injustice, all of it is the raw material of a life. Not a detour from your life, but the actual substance of it. When Marcus writes the obstacle becomes the way, he is expressing this: there is no separate path around the difficulty. The difficulty is the path. This does not mean passivity in the face of injustice. The Stoics believed strongly in civic engagement, in working for the common good, in fighting for what is right. But they fought without being consumed by the outcome of the fight. They acted with full energy and then released the result. The third exercise, the view from above. Marcus Aurelius practiced this regularly, taking his current concern and placing it against the scale of eternity. Whatever is troubling you right now, how significant will it be in 100 years? In 1,000? Against the backdrop of a cosmos that has been unfolding for billions of years, what is the size of your embarrassment, your resentment, your worry about what someone thinks of you? Again, this is not a way of dismissing what matters. It is a way of seeing clearly. We routinely make small things large by treating them as if they were permanent and universal, when they are temporary and local. The view from above restores proportion. The fourth exercise, the evening examination. Seneca described this most fully. Before sleep, sit quietly and review the day. Not to punish yourself, but to see clearly. Where was I anxious today about something I could not control? Where did I speak more harshly than I needed to? Where did I waste time that I will not recover? The point is not guilt. Guilt is just another way of focusing on the past, which is beyond control. The point is awareness. The doctor who does not examine the patient cannot treat the disease. And the fifth, remembering death. Memento mori, not as a shadow to be avoided but as a teacher to be consulted. If today were your last day, what would matter? What would fall away? The Stoics did not believe in dwelling on death morbidly. They believed in using the awareness of death to clarify the priorities of life. When we feel the finite weight of our time, we spend it differently. These practices, performed daily, imperfectly, with patience for the self that keeps failing and starting again, are what the Stoics called the path to eudaimonia, usually translated as happiness, but the Greek means something richer than that. Eudaimonia is the flourishing of a human being who is living in full accordance with their nature. The blooming of what was always there. The oak becoming fully an oak. The person becoming fully the person they have it in them to be. And the Stoics insisted this is their most radical claim, that eudaimonia is available to everyone. Not only to the rich, not only to the healthy, not only to the powerful, not only to those whose circumstances are favorable. A slave can live in eudaimonia. A prisoner can live in eudaimonia. A person facing death can live in eudaimonia. Because it depends on nothing external. It depends entirely on the quality of one's prohairesis, one's voluntary inner life. Epictetus was the proof, and his proof has never been answered. Stoicism did not disappear when Rome did, as the Western Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century, Visigoths sacking the Eternal City, the legions pulling back from the frontiers, the vast administrative apparatus of the empire dissolving into smaller and smaller local kingdoms. Much was lost. Libraries burned or were abandoned. Languages shifted. The continuity of institutional learning broke down. But Stoicism survived in the places where manuscripts survived. The monasteries of medieval Europe copied and preserved Seneca's letters with care, believing not entirely wrongly that his moral seriousness resonated with Christian teaching. The early Church Fathers had absorbed substantial amounts of Stoic thought into their theology. The concept of the Logos as a divine ordering principle, the universalism of human dignity that Stoic cosmopolitanism expressed, the ethics of inner virtue independent of external circumstance. Stoicism and early Christianity were not the same, but they were in conversation, and the conversation enriched both. In the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations survived because a scholar somewhere in that tradition recognized its value and kept it safe. Without that single act of preservation, one of the most intimate philosophical documents in human history would be gone. When the Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical texts, Stoicism returned to the center of European intellectual life. Michel de Montaigne, in 16th-century France, invented the essay form, largely as a vehicle for Stoic-inflected self-examination, honest, curious, personal, willing to notice the contradictions in oneself rather than covering them over. His essays read like conversations between the reader and someone who has been paying attention to their own inner weather for decades. Spinoza's concept of inner freedom, achieved through understanding rather than resistance. Kant's deontological ethics, with its insistence that the moral worth of an action lies in the quality of the will behind it rather than the outcome it produces. The entire tradition of moral philosophy that locates goodness in the character of the agent rather than in the results they achieve. All of this carries Stoic DNA. And then, in the 20th century, something extraordinary happened. In the years after World War II, two psychologists, Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck, working independently, developed what would become the most evidence-based form of psychotherapy in the world: cognitive behavioral therapy. The fundamental premise of CBT is this: it is not events that disturb us, but our interpretations of events. The thought between the event and the feeling is where the pathology lives. Change the thought, and the emotional response changes. Albert Ellis cited Epictetus directly. He knew where the idea came from. He was, in the most rigorous clinical sense, translating a 2,000-year-old philosophical practice into a therapeutic protocol. And the clinical trials that followed, decades of research across dozens of conditions, confirmed what Epictetus had insisted, that the relationship between external circumstances and internal suffering is mediated by judgment, and that judgment can be changed. CBT is now prescribed by doctors and practiced by therapists in every country in the world. Its foundation is Stoic. Viktor Frankl survived Auschwitz and Dachau. He came out of those camps with an observation that he spent the rest of his life developing into a full psychological theory that even in conditions of absolute external degradation, A human being retains the capacity to choose their attitude toward their suffering. That this capacity, this inner freedom, is the last freedom that can never be taken away. He called his therapy logotherapy. He had, in the extremity of the camps, independently arrived at what Epictetus had taught in the 1st century. Admiral James Stockdale spent more than 7 years as a prisoner of war in North Vietnam, subjected to torture, isolation, and systematic attempts to break his spirit. He survived, and he credited Epictetus. Before his deployment, he had read the Enchiridion. The distinction it made between what is up to us and what is not had become, for him, not a philosophical preference but a survival tool. "I never lost faith in the end of the story," he said. "I never doubted not only that I would get out, but also that I would prevail in the end and turn the experience into the defining event of my life." This is Stoicism lived under conditions that most of us will never face, and surviving them. Today, Stoicism is having what might be its widest public moment ever. Business leaders read Marcus Aurelius on planes. Tim Ferriss has introduced millions of readers and listeners to Stoic practices through his books and podcast. Ryan Holiday has written several best-selling books translating Stoic philosophy into contemporary language. The obstacle is the way, ego is the enemy, stillness is the key, and they have found audiences far beyond any traditional philosophy readership. Military special operations units incorporate Stoic concepts into their psychological training. Oncologists recommend Stoic practices to patients facing diagnosis. Coaches use Stoic frameworks with athletes learning to separate effort from result. Why now? Why this philosophy in this moment? Because we live in an age of maximum distraction and minimum stillness. Our phones deliver, at every waking moment, an endless feed of things we cannot control: the news, other people's opinions, the curated performances of lives that appear better than ours. We are soaking in comparison. We are training ourselves, daily, to want things that are not up to us: the approval of strangers, the trajectory of events, the feelings of other people toward us. And the result is a pervasive, low-grade, relentless anxiety that is, in Stoic terms, entirely predictable. We are suffering because we have misidentified where our energy belongs. Stoicism's response to this is not to retreat from the world, not to stop caring, not to cultivate indifference. It is to redirect, to ask, with every source of suffering, does this belong to my domain? Is this in my control? If not, open the hand. Not in defeat. In wisdom, there is a difference between resignation and acceptance, between passivity and strategic stillness. The Stoic who opens her hand to what she cannot change is not giving up. She is saving the energy, the finite, irreplaceable energy of a human lifetime, for the place where it can actually make a difference. Tonight, before you sleep, try just one question. You don't need to solve anything. You don't need to have it figured out. What am I holding on to right now? And is it mine to hold? If it's yours, if it falls within the domain of your own judgment, your own will, your own choices, then hold it. Give it everything you have, your effort, your attention, your full intention. If it's not yours, if it belongs to the category of things that will do what they do, regardless of how hard you grip, then practice, for just tonight, opening that hand. Not forever. Just tonight. Just let it be what it is, without your resistance pressing against it. Zeno washed up on the shore with nothing. He chose to walk toward the thing that mattered more than what he'd lost. Epictetus lay on the ground with a broken leg and felt no need to curse the one who broke it, because his peace was not stored in his leg. Seneca sat in a warm bath with blood on his wrists and kept speaking, because there was still something left to say, and saying it was in his control. Marcus Aurelius rose from his camp bed in the dark and wrote, "You were made for this. Get up." They all found the same thing in the end. Not happiness, not success, not safety, something harder to name and harder to lose. A stillness that lives inside the storm. not around it, not after it, inside it. That stillness is in you. It has always been in you. It does not require favorable conditions. It does not require that things go your way. It requires only that you turn toward it with the same deliberateness that Zeno showed when he walked into that bookshop, choosing philosophy over grief. Rest now. Let what cannot be controlled go gently to the edge of your awareness. And let what is yours, your breath, your quiet mind, your decision to meet tomorrow with intention, let that be the last thing you hold as you drift toward sleep. Next time, we descend into darkness together, into a cave where people have sat their entire lives, watching shadows on a wall, mistaking those shadows for the whole of reality. We're going to visit Plato, not the Plato of introductory philosophy courses, but the Plato who looked at the world around him and saw an elaborate and convincing illusion, and who spent his life trying to describe what lies behind it. If you have ever had the quiet suspicion that there is more to existence than what can be measured and weighed and posted and scrolled, that conversation is for you. If tonight's story reached you, please subscribe. Your support makes it possible to keep bringing these stories to the people who need them. Leave a like if something here landed for you. And if there's something you're holding tonight that you've been thinking about putting down, leave it in the comments. I'd love to know. This is a conversation, not a lecture, and your voice belongs in it. Good night. Rest well. And I'll see you next time.